Good morning, everyone. Welcome to MindSpeak. It's a real pleasure to have Professor Calestous Juma back for the second time. It was exactly a year ago, Calestous, if you remember. And I feel really privileged that at this moment when the cables have landed, when we really might be getting some real things going, that we have a chance to engage one of the sharpest minds, African minds, on this subject. So I'm really grateful. I could go on about all Calestous' accomplishments, but really I don't think there's a need. We'd prefer him to speak. And I'd just like to say again what a privilege it is to have you here, Calestous. And just if I might just quickly recount the story of the week. So on Monday I was trying to track down the professor, and I got this text saying, you know, I sent, so are we all good for Saturday? What? He said, I'm in Western Kenya. I said, well, have you forgotten? So this sort of started going on, these SMS messages. The next one I got, I can't communicate, network conflicts, too close to Uganda. And then the last one I got yesterday says, are you a flamethrower? So I said, I'll throw whatever flames you want. He said, I'm a flamethrower. So welcome, flamethrower. It's a privilege to have you. Thank you very much.
Good to be in the company of other flamethrowers, and this is almost like reporting back what we've done since I spoke here last, and I wanted to put my talk in the context of the landing of fiber optical cable, which is actually going to be with CECOM gets on stream, in fact, in less than a week, I believe. And then teams will follow after that, and this is going to open up just incredible opportunities for the continent. So what I wanted to do is just to give you a summary of my talk, and then we can either decide whether I should give more detail after the summary, or whether we should just go ahead and have Q&A. So when the cable lands, I think that's my vision of what Africa is likely to be like. And if Africans don't do it, or Kenyans don't do it, I think you can't blame people who have actually spent $700 million. This is just a single CECOM investment, probably the largest single investment in infrastructure in East Africa since the construction of colonial railways. This is a big thing. And so what I thought I would do is just give you, this is not long ago, thinking ahead, taking advantage of the cable. And that was about a week ago when we were launching the Multimedia Center in Kisumu. I had some difficulties opening the champagne, so I got some help from Dr. Ndemo. And next is the Vice Chancellor of KCA University looking on in a kind of a very studied look. This collision between me and Dr. Ndemo is actually functioning. And we wanted to do this partly because it's not enough just to preach about the role of technology in development. We actually wanted to do it ourselves. And I believe that development is actually easier done than said. That you can go and do something, but you may not be able to explain it. I thought basically my view is a very simple one, is that we need to really think seriously about the significant role that technological innovation plays in helping economies to recover, helping economies to grow, and spreading prosperity. And no economy really grows unless you have made significant use of particularly emerging technologies. This is really the essential part that I wanted to share with you this morning. It's not simply like picking up something and getting it to work. You really have to invest in it. The image that I have, and this is why I'm using this metaphor of rebooting the economy, is it's very much like adding new software into a computer, upgrading a computer. That's exactly how economies work, when you add new knowledge into the economy. And the way you add knowledge into the economy is through technologies. Technologies are simply embodiment of knowledge. And you can think of economic transformation simply as a process by which new knowledge is added into the economy. And the mechanism for doing that is private enterprises. If you are not creating new enterprises, chances are that your economy is actually not growing. And the best indicator on whether your economy is growing or not is whether you are creating new enterprises. It's not just enough to manage existing ones. It's actually more critical to create new ones. And we've seen this looking back, the evolution of the global economy has gone in waves. These are referred to as the long waves of economic transformation. The first wave from the 1780s was driven largely by water transportation, mechanization, textile, and a lot of work involving iron and steel. That bundling of technologies got exhausted, and a new wave followed after that, which is the wave driven by steam power, the railway, the steel industry, and of course the expansion of cotton production worldwide. That got countries like, regions like India integrated in the global economy. The third wave was driven by electrification, the emergence of the chemical industry, and of course the internal combustion engine became a major driver of that wave starting the 1900s into the period of the end of the Second World War. The fourth wave was driven basically by the discovery, expansion of oil extraction. And if you think of it carefully, the new waves incorporate the previous ones. They don't replace previous ones, so it's a cumulative process. And the more recent wave of economic transformation has been globally driven by the ICT sector. One additional element to this long wave of economic transformation is that at every stage of economic renewal, you get the recruitment of new countries joining the global economy. The last wave brought into the global economy the Southeast Asian countries. The previous one brought into the global economy countries like Japan. And the big message that I wanted to convey to all of you today is that the next wave is going to incorporate African countries into the global economy. And if you look carefully at the drivers of these waves, you notice that a lot of it is actually infrastructure. It's power, it's electrification, it's railways, it's roads. So infrastructure is extremely important as a foundation for economic transformation, followed by technical education, mostly building up capabilities in the engineering sciences. Because if you don't have engineers, you can't build railways and maintain them. And all these countries that have industrialized, they started off by laying the infrastructure, physical infrastructure, building human capabilities in the engineering sciences to maintain that infrastructure. And more importantly, they played a very important role in creating new businesses, most of which were connected to the expansion of infrastructure and to some extent connected to universities, where universities acted as incubators of new businesses. So the three critical elements for getting African economies to move is the infrastructure, investment in technical education, particularly in the engineering sciences, and thirdly, the area of creating businesses, of creating new businesses. And I'll elaborate on that later on. Now, I have to confess here, most people think of Africa, they talk about Africa as if it was a small place. I get my colleagues who say, oh, I have just returned from Africa. But even Africans don't appreciate how big Africa is. It's big enough to fit the United States in it, China, Western Europe, India, Argentina, and have enough room to sneak in the United Kingdom. And that leaves a lot of space for literal hundreds of Singapore. So actually it's a fairly a fairly large place. But you look at its state of infrastructure, it's fairly limited. You've got, this is the railway network, most of them constructed during the colonial period, in the early days of colonization. So we haven't done very much in extending critical infrastructure like railways. We can't move goods and services, which is one of the reasons we can't actually trade effectively on the global market. Very limited distribution of power transmission lines. Similarly, very limited distribution of primary road networks. We have got a lot of secondary road networks, most of them seasonal, but very few primary road networks. This is a clear example of why the continent is moving and growing relatively slowly. But despite that, we've seen tremendous growth in the last decade. In fact, Africa growing faster than most parts of the world, other than Southeast Asian economies. A large part of it driven by investments in minerals, oil being an example. We know quite well about China's involvement in the continent and the impact that China has had, especially on those countries that export raw materials to the continent, contributed quite significantly to the growth of the continent. More importantly, China's investment has also been linked to investment in infrastructure, because when you're interested in minerals, you're interested in moving them. So China has had a vested interest in making sure that it can move the minerals, and that has led China to start investing in transportation particularly. Partly for their own interest, but the same infrastructure can be used to stimulate local economic growth. And that's the main reason why many African leaders have been looking to China, because the investment China is putting on the continent also contributes to the expansion of infrastructure. The other critical element is that China is starting to increase its admission of African students into its universities, many of them going into the engineering sciences. There are about 3,000 students admitted into Chinese universities annually now. And hopefully many of these people will come back, because China's interest is for them to come back and help to maintain the infrastructure. And this is a signal to everybody that this is really an indication of where we should be focusing ourselves domestically, which is putting resources in critical infrastructure. But what I wanted to really talk about is none of this is really significant unless we recognize the importance of the availability of large quantities of technical knowledge that is available today that can help African countries leapfrog technologically, in that they can start to create new businesses without having to reinvent, in fact, new technologies. Because most of the technologies that Africa needs to start growing rapidly as an economy are already available today. It's estimated that technical knowledge is doubling every 14 months. This is whether you're looking at scientific publications or patents, or just simply the availability of expertise, including, in fact, human expertise. Expansion of computing capability. May be familiar with the so-called Moore's law, but this is a phenomenon that is affecting a large number of technological fields. We now have hundreds of satellites in space. Actually, as of April this year, there are about 888 functioning satellites in space, of which about 70 are focused on Earth observation, collecting a lot of data, which is beamed back to Earth, which is now becoming a basis for the creation of new businesses, especially in the area of geographic information sciences. You wouldn't have GPS. You wouldn't actually have functioning cell phones if you didn't have this large number of satellites actually operating in space. And more interestingly, the shortening of time frames between the discovery of an idea and the commercialization of a product. We are now down to most products basically being available within 5 years from the discovery of the idea to the delivery of that product to the marketplace. So you don't have to wait a lifetime to actually develop new products. And I'll give you some examples of that. This is facilitated also by greater connectivity, of which the fiber optic cable is going to really play a very critical role in getting Africa connected to the global knowledge economy. With this phenomena of technological succession, where new technologies replacing old ones, and the newer ones being more effective, cheaper, and functionally superior to the old one. So you go back to this 5-year time frame. This is the rate at which we are starting to see this phenomenon of technological succession. A good example of that is the mobile phone, which not long ago was a dream for most children. I'm not going to ask how many of you have cell phones. This is a question that used to be asked 10 years ago. Today the question is how many of you don't have cell phones? That's an easier question to ask. And our good colleague, hard-working colleague, who has really made us globally connected, Dr. Ndemo, tells me that when mobile phones arrived in Kenya, they cost as much, one single phone cost as much as buying a 4-bedroom house in Buruburu. So people had to make a choice between having a mobile phone, it's about 250,000 Kenya shillings, buying a mobile phone or actually owning a house in Buruburu. And I think that the choice then was mostly obvious. But many people think that we call them mobile phones because we carry them around. Actually, the first mobile phone developed by Ericsson in 1956 weighed 42 kilos. This is what it looked like. I can hardly think of any of you going around texting, sending text messages using that device. We had the Motorola car phones. This was the first Nokia mobile phone. When it was developed, people didn't think there would be a market for it. It weighed about 20 kilos, but it sold out almost instantly. It took one guy, Martin Cooper, who in 1983, after 10 years of effort of saying this technology must be put in the hands of people, not in cars, so people can carry it around. He developed a Dynatac in 1983. It cost about $4,000, weighed just under 1 kilogram. This was huge. And people joked about it, they were referring to it as the brick. Now you have towers everywhere. This was, if you look carefully, you will see a gentleman coming down that tree. This is in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. When cell phones were introduced there, the network was very limited, so people have to go up trees to make phone calls. I got this photograph was sent to me by Aliou Conte, who is the CEO of Vodacom Congo, just giving me an indication of where he came from. This is the largest mobile provider in the Congo. I'm sure many of you here have actually climbed trees to get signal not long ago. It's now ubiquitous. This gentleman had a business. The business was actually selling rubber bands. That I believe that was somewhere in Ethiopia. I don't have to tell you about M-Pesa, which you are very familiar with, which is actually a Kenyan invention that was developed because we had access to the technology in the first place. And none of the Kenyans were involved in the invention of the mobile phone. This is why I believe that our focus should be really identifying existing technologies and developing businesses around it. The limiting factor has really been the area of the speed at which we are able to access the rest of the global network. I was going to just show you. This is. It takes you, if you have a local high-speed internet network, it takes you roughly 10 seconds to download a page of Wall Street Journal. You have to wait a little longer if you are using basically a more distant. This is mid-orbit satellites, and this is what it takes essentially for people in Africa to download. It takes about 40 something seconds. You have to wait a very long time, and that has a huge impact on being able to do business. In fact, most of the time you can't even get connected anyway. This is why you get this echo, because the signal has to go up and down, and the latency between the sending of the signal and for it to come down, basically most of the time gets disconnected. So you can't get into web point 2 unless you have high speed connectivity. And that is also related to essentially how much you pay for it, because it's taking much longer to be connected. Uh, this just gives you the price difference. This is what I pay in my university, and this is what people in West Africa pay, and you can see obviously why it's so inhibitive. And it's because we haven't been connected to fiber optic cable, which is, as you see, mostly the eastern part of Africa has been totally isolated. But what's been interesting is the reduction in the cost of installing fiber optic cable is roughly 1/10 what it was a decade ago. That's why it's possible now to do it. You can see major investments, of which the most advanced currently are TIMS and SECOM. As I said, SECOM will be getting on stream shortly. In fact, the president of Tanzania will be flipping the switch. And not long after that, we'll see TIMS coming on stream as well. And you can see there are 6 other major investments being already planned for the continent. We're looking at a continent that's going to be instantly connected to the rest of the world with internal wiring. And in addition to that, we have another major investment that is going to be launched by the end of next year, which is the other 3 billion network led by Google, which is basically a network of 16 satellites that will be launched into space. Each of the satellites will have 10 antennas, actually 12 antennas, of which 10 of them will have the possibility to be remotely directed with a flexibility of about 26 degrees. It creates a footprint of roughly 500 kilometers footprint. And that means that you can be anywhere in Africa. It's covering all the tropical regions. You'll be anywhere in Africa, be able to subscribe to the O3B networks. And nobody has to come to your home to survey it. You just need to give the coordinates, and you will have instant connectivity. They have designed it in such a way that you have in-orbit redundancy, so that when one satellite has passed, another one actually kicks in. So you won't lose connection. This is going to be by 2011. This service will be actually available. So if you combine this with the fiber optical cable, this is catering largely for the interior of Africa, where it may be too difficult to get fiber optical cable in there. When this is all done, the continent would really be a new place in terms of business opportunities, in terms of access to knowledge, and in terms of opportunities for additional investments. But also, more importantly, the continent will be able to also provide its content to the rest of the world, not just to receive, but to be able to provide content to the rest of the world. The world is going mobile, essentially. This is mobile broadband is going to be the future. A market for access devices. But one other interesting development is going to be the convergence of these devices, so that instead of having a lot of different devices, you will actually have one device that is a telephone, is a laptop, is your camera, and will do all the other functions that you need. We're also starting to see basically companies starting to put their content online. Books will become online, libraries will be online, new markets for development of applications, which I consider to be a big area for Africa to move into, especially applications of relevant to the continent. And storage of content is getting cheaper and cheaper. If just a comparison of what it was when the Macintosh was first launched. Today it's really so cheap that, in fact, it doesn't make sense for people to have their own storage capability. So we're moving into this field called cloud computing, where there will be companies that will host basically your content, your software, and then you'll have a very simple device that allows you to access it. That is also linked to the development of new institutions, training institutions, of which the Multimedia University College in this country is an example. And our effort in Kisumu of creating the Multimedia Center is again linked to these possibilities of preparing the next generation of Kenyans to start thinking about how to create businesses that take advantage of this infrastructure. Now, this is not just limited to IT. This is also a phenomenon we are starting to see in other fields. in the area of energy, for example, great potential for wind power. Wind energy is expanding fairly rapidly. And as you can see in the context of Africa, in fact, one of the areas that has great wind potential is the Horn of Africa. And the peace in Somalia, for example, will have significant impact in allowing that region to become a supplier of wind power to the IGAD region. There's the new designs of wind turbines. This is a Canadian technology, which is simply a balloon that you can tether anywhere and be able to generate your own power. This is being tested at the moment, and the designers of this product were looking for only $5 million to support a pilot project. So any Kenyan business person could have actually had access to this technology and piloted it here in Africa. It was readily available, and the developers were looking for opportunities outside North America. I don't have to tell you about the sun, where this is being in the tropics, but it's now projected that in the next 30 to 40 years, in fact, solar energy might become one of the largest sources of power worldwide. And as a continent, we should be thinking about how to take advantage of this potential. In fact, Europe is already considering building large solar power plants in North Africa to supply Europe. If Europe is thinking along those lines, we should also be thinking about how to supply ourselves with the solar power, because the technology is already available. In fact, the best technology I'm aware of is available not far from here. It's been developed by Israeli engineers and scientists, and we should be talking to Israel about access to solar energy technology at the moment. Other developments, this is an interesting technology being developed by the Taiwanese. Somebody who thought, why is it so that whenever they look at any taxi, they only see, most of the time they see one passenger. So they said, why do we use cars that have four-seater cars when most of the time there's only one person? So they thought that maybe you could have a one-seater taxi. And if you had a one-seater taxi, you can start to use solar power essentially for that taxi. Instead of parking under a tree, which is what most taxis do in Eastern Africa, you would then park it under the sun, which will enable you essentially to run taxi networks. This technology is likely to be available in the market in the next year or so. And this was designed by students at one of the universities in Taiwan. Actually, there's no reason why Kenya should not venture into these kinds of technologies. Similarly, in the area of agriculture, we've seen rapid advances, particularly in the area of genetic modification, with almost everywhere in the world, rapid adoption of genetically modified seed that resist pests, use less chemicals, or are adapted to dry conditions. Africa is starting to move into that area now. There are 3 countries that have adopted genetically modified seed: South Africa, Burkina Faso, and Egypt. And I'm very pleased that Kenya has in fact adopted a biosafety bill that will allow this country to introduce these products in a safe and responsible way. And we predict that in the next 10 years, Africa is going to be a very important market for the development of agricultural biotechnology. That's an example of to your left. I can't say that. So to your right is a seed that is not genetically engineered to withstand drought, and the other is just giving you a contrast of what it takes to be able to grow these new varieties. And I'm hoping that more business people in Kenya will actually move into adopting these products. The same goes for fish. Major advances in fish breeding. This is a technology that's been developed for salmon production. These 2 fish are actually the same age. The top one has a gene that enables it to produce more growth hormone. It's just like giving your car more fuel, and it just grows faster. And the gene is extracted from another fish, so you are not moving genes from one organism to a totally different organism. And a colleague of mine who developed this technology, Dr. Elliot Entis, has been very interested in making this technology available to the developing countries. So I asked him about 5 years ago whether he could do it for tilapia. The reason I was interested in tilapia, for obvious reasons, I come from Port Victoria and the shores of the shores of Lake Victoria. So I said, can it work for tilapia? I was not interested in salmon. And he's actually developed it for tilapia already. It works. Now, that's not genetically modified tilapia, but he has, in fact, developed the technology, and I'm hoping to make that technology available to East Africa as well, especially in the area of fish farming. And it works for every possible fish. Obviously, there have been concerns, debates. Europeans have been have had concerns about the safety of the products. In fact, a lot of the European countries are, in fact, doing field trials using genetically engineered crops at the moment. Interestingly enough, the most critical countries, including France, UK, Germany, also have the largest investment in R&D in genetic engineering. Their concern has always been that they needed to develop products of relevance to their countries rather than import products from other places. And my interest has been that Africa should do the same, is identify crops of relevance to Africa, and then work with whoever has the technology to make that technology available on the continent. I'm sure there will be questions about genetically modified organisms later on. In the same thing with the health sector, I think the swine flu has reminded us again about the importance of emerging infectious diseases. But there are some areas which we have still neglected. For example, very high rates of maternal mortality in Africa, the continent being the leading, basically in terms of deaths of women during childbirth. I think Kenya's, I believe the rate for Kenya is almost equivalent to that of Southeast Asia, a little less than that, about 415 deaths, and that's totally unacceptable because many of the technology needed to diagnose that early enough are actually available today. Ultrasound technology, which not long ago, I would say, that's about a decade ago, that unit was costing about $20,000. About 5 years ago, it was down to about $2,000. That's a technology originally developed for the U.S. military. You can put it in a backpack, and therefore you could transport it around. I was actually working with a colleague of mine at Harvard Medical School to try to bring that technology to Kenya. And then I got phone calls that, in fact, that has already been superseded by new technologies. This is a technology that has already been approved by US FDA, which is one of the smallest ultrasound technologies available today. You can view it on a computer screen. As you can see from that image, it's going to replace stethoscopes, the traditional stethoscopes. This is what doctors will be wearing around. And I was trying to figure out whether this is available would be available to African countries as well. Colleagues of mine pointed out that a new technology had already been developed at the University of Washington in St. Louis that would enable a doctor to send the signal to a cell phone so the doctor can read the image on a cell phone. That is the technology, and the inventors essentially are thinking of reducing the price of that device to $100. This is literally over a 10-year period. We've had a drop in ultrasound technology from $20,000 to basically $100. This is for personal use. So this will be available to homes where you can take the image, send it to a doctor. The doctor looks at it, and if the doctor can't read it, the doctor can send you a text message and say, "Can you try again?" And you can try again. Now, the two colleagues there, the two professors, obviously they are not medical doctors. They are electronic engineers, because if they are medical doctors, they would know very well that that's not the place to test for pregnancy. They have actually since then sent me an image of a photograph of where it's actually being tried out in West Africa in the right way. And this is again, just indicating to you the potential that exists there, where you don't have to actually invent these new technologies. They are readily available. The key issue is to really start figuring out how to develop businesses around them. And let me give you some suggestions, at least in my view, of what it takes Africa to advance rapidly and take advantage of these emerging technologies and put them into commercial use. I think of innovation simply as a process by which you upgrade where your goods, services, or processes, where you have a discernible improvement in performance. This is what innovation is really about. But more importantly, it's not an innovation if it's not spreading in the marketplace. If it's an idea sitting in the lab, it's not an innovation. It has to have an impact on the economy. As I pointed out already, infrastructure is particularly critical, but not just roads. Thinking of the broad area of infrastructure, which is public utilities, energy, telecoms, water supply, sanitation, public works, which is installation of irrigation systems, schools, houses, hospitals, transportation networks, and finally, research facilities. We think that the creation of research facilities, particularly in universities and research institutes, should be part of the national infrastructure. We also have been thinking, because infrastructure is a very knowledge intensive, but also requires a lot of capital investment. And the question has always been, can you do it only through the private sector? My argument is that you can't. This is an area where the public sector could play a very important role. And I've been having communication and discussions with colleagues of mine in various countries on the possible role of the military to leverage and mobilize the military to help contribute to extension of infrastructure in the African countries. This would not be new. In fact, the Roman roads, which was the most critical infrastructure that helped to expand the Roman Empire, was built by the military. The term engineering is basically derived from the Old Latin for builders of military machines, but a lot of them were used in infrastructure construction. It wasn't until the 1820s that we started to see this term civil engineering, because all engineering used to be military engineering. And I think we need to get our armed forces, because they have the capability, they have the discipline, and they have the knowledge to actually build and expand infrastructure, telecoms, roads, railways. And in my conversations with a lot of them across Africa, there's a lot of interest and eagerness. In one country, I talked to the military, and they said, we can do it, we are ready to do it, but we are not going to be answerable to the Minister for Public Works. And I said, that's actually very easy to solve, because in most countries, the president is also the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, so they can be answerable to their boss, who is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. This is an area that I'm going even further and suggesting that in many African countries that have they all have military colleges, that these military colleges be expanded into engineering universities so that they can help to expand infrastructure, because the private sector cannot do it alone. Then we get the area of technical education that I pointed out. I was visiting my good friend at Moi University Vice Chancellor, Richard Mibey, who has acquired a textile mill, which is the Rivertex that had been abandoned. He's actually revived it. It's functioning at 10% capacity utilization. He's producing goods, in fact, textile products. His biggest problem right now is, in fact, shortage of cotton. These are two colleagues, actually. One of them is the managing director of the textile component of the university, and the other one is the deputy vice chancellor of KCA University. And actually, the reason they are laughing is not because they like that Kikoi says, wacha vituko vyako. And I was suggesting to them that the Moi University should add a comma at the end of it, so that it reads, wacha vituko vyako, comma, pumbafu. And I think that I'm trying to brand. I want to actually have copyright on this word pumbaf, because I think it has potential market possibilities worldwide. that's why they are laughing. The fact they were laughing to me indicated that there's a possibility in it. So I would like to try it out. And if there are any business people who will take it up and commercialize it, I would like to have a percentage of it to help me fund the multimedia center in Kisumu. There are other examples, universities that train people to create businesses, of which Art University in Costa Rica is a leading example. The Pontifical University of Rio de Janeiro has a center called the Genesis Institute, which produces companies. And every time they have a graduation ceremony, one is for students and the other one is for companies created in the Genesis Institute. Basically, the university also functions as an incubator of businesses. This is the reverse, where you have universities creating businesses. And here's an example where businesses are creating universities. And there's no reason why many of the Kenyan public corporations cannot incubate their own universities. It's been done elsewhere. It can be done here as well. Then we also have the other critical area, which is what we do with the younger people so that they have the technical literacy needed to think early enough about the potential for new technologies. There's going to be a demo out there of these $100 laptops. But these are 12-year-old kids in Nigeria repairing the $100 laptops, the Exos. I serve on the board of directors of the $1 Laptop Foundation. And when we first introduced them, everybody said, oh, they are toys, they will never work. We have distributed them worldwide over 1 million units. And the philosophy we had right from the beginning is that they have to be designed in such a way that young people can repair them. But when young people repair them, they also pick up the technical expertise needed to prepare them to become engineers in the future. And that's one of the reasons we're actually doing it. I know there are leaders here who say they are toys, and this is actually because of rumors that were spread about 5 years ago by competitors. And I would like to encourage those leaders to have another look at these laptops. Rwanda has become the learning center, global learning center for the one laptop per child foundation. These are kids at the airport in Rwanda, which is the only place you can find a signal. This is Uruguay, which has made a decision to provide all kids in Uruguay with the laptops. It's been so popular that the government has put the laptop on one of its stamps as part of a promotion. And then we have a very small market in the Vatican. And I'm a Catholic, by the way, so I'm very proud to see that the Pope is actually taking this seriously. The laptop is being handed over to him by a colleague of ours who is a member of the Brazilian Academy of Sciences. And the area of business incubation, I don't have to emphasize this, it's particularly obvious, but I wanted to stress the importance of the availability of venture capital, which is getting people who have access to capital to be able to connect with those who have access to ideas, which is the young people, and be able to translate those ideas into businesses. We can discuss a little bit more about that. The area of international trade, this country is going to be hosting the AGOA conference, I believe, next year, and there are enormous possibilities for Africa to actually participate under the AGOA program. As from what I understand, our exports have been very limited to a very small number of categories of products, largely in the textile sector. But the range of products that we can export to the US, just US alone, is tremendous. But we have to build that engineering capability to be able to become manufacturers. And the area of regional integration, I find this to be extremely important, especially as a starting point to become major players in the global economy. If you can't play at home, you can't play internationally. It's like a league. If you are not winning at home, it's unlikely that you will win in the World Cup.
There are two kinds of innovations. There are innovations that address needs of the people. There are innovations that address wants. And as we all know, a need is something we can never do without, like agriculture and all that, yeah? It's about food, we can't live without food. And the wants are on the other end, the mobiles, we can live without them, but they're essential for our day-to-day. My question is, how do you as the leadership, as the people at the forefront, ensure there's good prioritization in terms of where focus is put. Because if we look at areas where we are going now, we are following the American trend. The Americans already have addressed their needs, their food, their everything, as we don't have food. So how then do we prioritize so that our innovations meet our immediate concerns? We don't have water now. We don't have food. Soon we won't have electricity. Americans have that. So they can deal with the ultrasound and all that, you know. So how then do we prioritize well to ensure our needs are really met first? Then we go to the wants. Thank you.
Yeah, I think your characterization is misguided. I don't think you can consider a cell phone as a luxury. A cell phone has become a driver of economic transformation. It's not a luxury. I don't think ultrasound is a luxury. Human health is not a luxury. A doctor being able to diagnose a problem and fix it in time cannot be a luxury at all. So that separation between wants and needs, I actually don't think it's valid. Secondly, I don't think this is just an American idea. I can give you numerous examples which are not American. In fact, most of my examples come from Southeast Asia. The fact that I come from America does not necessarily mean that I'm only bringing American ideas. So that characterization I don't agree with. Many things that may look like they're luxury now become drivers of economic transformation. Producing food is now become directly linked to the communication sector. A person in a home has grown, somewhere has grown their crops, and they have their tomatoes, but they are trying to figure out which market to send it to because it's going to rot shortly. But they don't want to send it to a market that's flooded with other tomatoes. They can send a text message and they get a signal what the price is, how far it is, and whether that's the right place to send it. That text message may appear to you when you are sending it to your friends as a luxury, but for that person, it's a critical element in the ability to meet their needs. So I don't think that characterization is an appropriate one. My view is that a large part of our being poor is very much linked to the fact that we have not developed that capability to take existing technologies, whatever they are, and put them to serve us, rather than say, oh, technologies come from the West, therefore if we adopt it, we are becoming Westerners. The Japanese borrowed everywhere. The Japanese have not become Americans. The word pedal in Japanese is pedali, because that technology actually came in from outside. They adapted it and put it to local use. And that is a sign of courage and basically self-confidence, the ability to take technologies from wherever they are and make them your own without being insecure that if I use somebody's technology, it might change me into being somebody else. We need to have the courage and the self-confidence to say, that technology serves our needs, let's adapt it and make it our own. That is what I think we ought to be aiming at, rather than this faulty characterization, which I don't think is actually academically competent anyway in the first place. But I see it in the literature, I see it in debates in various places, and I think it's contributed a lot to keeping us behind.
Professor Juma, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. As I said at the outset when we were chatting, I'm from Malawi, and in rebooting the economy, one of the big reforms has clearly been in the agriculture sector, which you touched upon. Can you comment on the application of technology to raising agriculture productivity, but specifically with reference to irrigation and fertilizer? because while Malawi has been very successful recently in that area, I don't think we've quite cracked the irrigation side, and I would really like to hear from you on this issue. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a good example, which is when the president of Malawi became president 5 years ago. He decided to appoint himself the Minister for Agriculture for very good reasons, because he reasoned that if your country is starving and you are the president, you must take some responsibility. He was criticized very heavily. People accused him of being dictatorial, amassing too much power. He became the Minister for Agriculture and Food Security. And within a very short time, by introducing credit to support farmers, to subsidize farmers rather than subsidize consumers. His vision is very simple. He said, if you subsidize, one of the reasons we subsidize consumers is to try to keep the prices low so that people can afford it. He reasoned that one way to actually reduce food prices is to produce more food. And the way you do that is you give credit to enable farmers to have access to fertilizers and other agricultural inputs. He actually did that very successfully. Within 2 years, he had reversed the famine situation. Malawi is now an exporter of food. His Christmas card, of which I received one last year, says, "We achieved food security in Malawi." That's his message. But he also had the vision to notice that just giving the inputs was not sufficient. You needed to invest in agricultural research. So he then also appointed himself the Minister for Research, Science and Technology, for which he was widely criticized. And I have to confess that I was a strong supporter of him taking over that portfolio, because he needed to link the Ministry of Agriculture to the research infrastructure so that he can start to invest in research. And he went further and actually created his own private university, established the University of Southern Malawi, to help serve as a role model. So this connection between research and production, especially where you have hit the limits in the use of existing inputs, is absolutely essential. I'm also working with the colleagues actually in Malawi, including the Malawi Defense Force, on exploring how you could extend the role of the military in the infrastructure area, which includes irrigation, because this has become the critical limiting factor in that investment in infrastructure is very interesting. You can't do it on a small scale. You can't say, okay, I'm going to build a road from Mombasa to Nairobi, but I'll build it only from Mombasa to Kibwezi, and if it works, then I will extend it. You can't do that. You have to build it all the way. So the initial capital investment is usually very large. The same applies to the fiber optic cable. You can't say, I will build it from South Africa to Mozambique, and if it works, then I'll extend it to Tanzania, and if it works, then I'll extend it to Kenya, and then I'll extend it into Europe. You have to do it all the way. So the initial capital outlay is usually large, and this is why I think this is what led me in the case of Malawi of saying, let's start to explore how to bring in other assets in the country, like the Malawi Defense Force, to help in extending infrastructure, of which irrigation is one. You have irrigation, you have roads, you have telecoms and other fields. And I think Malawi is a clear role model for what African countries can do. And the key element with Malawi has been that the president, one of the reasons the president took over those two ministries is because ministers cannot instruct other ministers to do things. The Minister for Agriculture cannot go to the Minister for Transportation and say, food is rotting in Kibwezi, please build a road there to get the food to the marketplace. What they will do is they will create an interministerial committee. Interministerial committees don't work very well. When you have something as critical as agriculture, you need high-level coordination. And what the president did was, by appointing himself, he became the coordinator in that he can call on the different ministries to provide the inputs needed. So I'm actually advocating right now openly that for countries that face critical food shortages, that the presidents or prime ministers should be in charge of the agriculture portfolio. And the president of Malawi is my role model because he's done it, it's worked, And I'm aggressively advocating that this mechanism be adopted by others as well, because agriculture is the single most important sector for most of the poor countries. And with the presidency is not taking care of that sector, chances are that economies are not going to be transformed. I hope I answered your question, and I'm very proud of the president of Malawi for the leadership, the courage, and he's stuck in there. They tried to expel him from the political party that sponsored him. He created his own.
He won a landslide.
And he won a landslide. He has a fresh mandate. He's a model, a role model that other leaders should emulate.
The biggest problem in many parts of Africa is poor governance. Can you give us your thoughts on how we can innovate in governance, make our leaders more accountable, and particularly the role of the private sector in making this happen?
Yeah, this is a very broad question, but I'll narrow it a little bit, which is that my view of governance is less about the individuals, but more about how you structure the government system. How you organize the structure of cabinet is actually more important than who runs those offices. Thinking very carefully about what are the functions of the president, what are the functions of the prime minister, given the priorities of the time. I gave you the example of Rwanda, where the president of Rwanda is very committed to extending ICT as a foundation of economic transformation. The Minister for Science and Technology has also the IT portfolio, but operates in the presidency. So there's a very clear indication there that they are taking this seriously, so that when President Kagame calls somebody and says, I'm interested in doing something on IT, people will respond because they know he has a minister in his own office who will execute it. The case of Malawi, where you have the president personally becomes the minister for agriculture. Anybody who is trying to do agriculture will go to Malawi because they know this president takes agriculture seriously. So this is how we deal with the priorities, in that you need a strategic vision. That strategic vision will lay out what needs to be done. If you say we want to industrialize, that function has to be led and coordinated through the presidency. Now this is different from the governance issues that have to do with elections, have to do with corruptions. I don't think you can actually run an effective economy where the system is very corrupt. This is something that has to be dealt with. And I have my thoughts on how to deal with the corruption. I don't think it has to do with throwing people in jail. It has to do with expanding the power of transparency. If Africa had a corruption-free radio, where anybody who is suspected of being corrupt or received a bribe, his name gets announced on Africa Free Radio, it's going to be a major deterrent for people knowing that their name might be mentioned on a Africa corruption-free radio. Secondly, posting things on the web, forms on the internet, so that when any transactions have taken place, they're publicly available. These tools, which actually come from ICT, are going to be very powerful in reducing the corruption. I'm not saying they shouldn't prosecute. I think that's an important part of the judicial process. But I'm saying that there are other tools of reducing corruption that we haven't effectively utilized. And I think ICT is going to be a very powerful tool in expanding transparency, expanding accountability. And the final part I wanted to mention is I come from the Kennedy School of Government, and what we do is we train leaders. And the reason the school exists in the United States is because some people realized ages ago that leaders are not born to lead. You actually have to train them. And I would like to see in Africa the emergence of schools of government that train people on how to govern. A lot of the poor governance is actually a consequence of ignorance. It's not a consequence of malice. These people are not trained to govern.